Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It is truly a pleasure to be here again in this blessed month of Ramadan. So, Ramadan Mubarak to everyone. It almost feels as though there was a calling from high above that brought us back to this place for this important work. So, with me again is Harry Fear, whom I consider as among the best intellects in the world, someone who had shown remarkable insight from a very young age. Those people who are exceptionally talented at a young age are called prodigies. But imagine if there are a group of prodigies in a room and you somehow amalgamate their talents into a single person, then you get somebody like the brilliance of Harry Fear. And you know, our Islamic history, particularly the Islamic Golden Age, is filled with Muslim scholars who were exceptional in multiple disciplines. They were called the polymaths. And we need to revive that tradition in these times. So, with that introduction, let us begin with today's proceedings. A great deal has happened recently in the world's geopolitics, especially surrounding the situation with the Iran war, which is on the back of the Palestine-Israel conflict. So I'll begin with asking you my questions and we'll cover this topic. Okay, my first question is, sir, by the way, any initial words you would like to?
No, please.
Yeah, so my first question is, Iran is the country that has stood up the most for the Palestine cause. What do you make of the current situation of the Iran war after the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei and Iran's nuclear program?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yeah, it's good to be back here and to have to have this opportunity to talk about Iran. I think it's a important thing to do because I think a lot of people are horrified by the last couple of weeks, and I feel that there is sort of some responsibility on us to sort of produce some content about this. I can see that even within a day or two of Trump's war, various people felt so demoralized by the state of the world that they just disabled their social media because they kind of couldn't cope with what they were seeing. And I feel that there's an obligation on us to try to make sense of what's happening and talk about it a little, even though it may lead us to not very optimistic conclusions at the superficial level. But by hopefully creating some order around it, it helps others see it and regulate around it. I think one of the first things to capture is, with the Iran situation, that we're in quite a strange world because there is, of course, the Iranian leader who's passed away, and then there's the Iranian leadership, and then there's the Iranian sort of government, which I would define more widely to be also the institutions and probably the security and military apparatus. But then there's also the Iran as a country. And I think a lot of people probably overwhelmingly feel sympathy with Iran as a country at the moment, regardless of how they shape themselves politically on something like the Iranian government or the late Iranian leader. And I think also it's impossible not to contextualize this in the Gaza genocide, because people know very well that, even if people don't know very well that Iran has a history of supporting Hamas, for example, people know very well that Israel's going after Iran, and Israel also committed genocide against the Palestinians. So it falls in this. And I think this puts us in a sense of the world where people feel like, oh, the Americans and Israelis are at it again, and the Gaza genocide vibe is back, but now it's at Iran. And I think that's the sense that people broadly have, and I think that is the correct sense. That is essentially what what is happening here, and that's why people feel disempowered and switch off. I think one of the really important things to say, moving beyond these simplifications and essentializations, is that if we start digging into Iran and Israel and the US and the nuclear agreement, Iran actually, firstly, is subject in its sort of external renderings in the Western world to, of course, like racism and propaganda and all of the usual tropes and all the rest of it. One of the most important things about the real sort of reality of Iran is that actually it's been in a position, broadly speaking, of what's called strategic patience, which in the month of Ramadan is quite an interesting sort of vibe to note. But basically, Iran is a neighbor, not immediately, of the Israelis. And in a sense, Israel is like the kid in the playground whose parents have given him drugs and a taser and a baseball bat. And this kid just basically goes around and smashes up anyone whenever he feels like it. And the Iranian approach to this has been to sort of lie low, but try to be as sort of patient strategically in the region as possible. So the image that we have of Iran, that it's this kind of terror regime that has been, you know, sowing havoc in the Middle East and has threatened Israel and threatened all these Westerners living in Dubai and all the rest of it, is basically a big BS. That's one of the main things to say. And it's a very essential comment to make, but basically there was no threat from Iran. Iran hasn't invaded anyone. It wasn't going to invade anyone. And so in a sense, to slightly exaggerate it rhetorically for a second, but Iran is like the quiet kid in the corner who's been minding his own business to an extent, and they've decided to go after him now. So far from posing an immediate threat to the Israelis or Americans, they've gone after Iran and started a fight. A question of how that all manifests and where that goes is a separate one, but I think it's really important to talk about the Iranian strategic patience, because that just illuminates that this is a regime that carefully thinks things through, whereas the Israelis and Americans act with the hubris of not thinking things through to the same extent. So there's this sort of disparity there. And I think that, just to zoom back out to the macro picture for a second, starting to put what's happening in some sense and context, I think it's the feeling that after Venezuela, and also here speaking in Southeast Asia, having been to Vietnam recently, it's impossible to not put it in the context that this is essentially the Americans and Israelis going after anyone that's in their way of their global power ambitions, really. Anyone that they can go after, they will. They can't really go after China and Russia, so they go after everyone else. And I think people have a sense that, oh, this is just, you know, another tragic episode of sort of American-Israeli imperial hubris, just knocking over another country and another stable society or whatever. And I mentioned Vietnam because, in a sense, it's impossible not to see this through the lens of economics, and that the Americans, you know, will go after anyone, just like with Cuba, that doesn't, you know, follow their financial model. So in this sense, they're sort of going after the capitalist empire. But with the Israelis, it's not as economic. It's also ideological. It has religious sort of undertones, if not overtones. And both of them speak to the kind of cancerous infinite growth mindset that is like sort of the worst of human civilization. The war in Iran just represents the latest episode of that. So that's how I see it. So in a sense, it's not really about Iran for being Iran at all. It's very much this imperial hubris needed a new vent, and this is the latest surface and war theatre for it.
Okay. My second question is that is there a strong connection to the recent Iran war and the Palestine-Israel conflict? And I'll add the Russia-Ukraine war here as well. To what extent are all these interconnected?
The thing that, again, we have to remember, I mentioned this before when talking with you, but I feel that it's essential to remind ourselves that chaos, war, and conflict may seem terrible to us, but there are certainly factions within the American government or the Israeli government, and there certainly are people who don't mind war as long as they're not the ones suffering with it. And to go further than that, and to fall on the back of the to pick up the back of the previous comment about the economic tone here, that actually war is good for business, and infinite war is good for business. It just depends whose economy you're feeding. That is to say that Gaza has been paused in the sense that if I can put it this way, the big bombs have stopped falling. But now they've just been diverted to Iran. And there are certainly factions in the American administration who would be okay with a new endless war in Iran for various complex reasons. And then ditto on the Israeli side, they would be happy with an infinite war of attrition with Iran, where they can just grind it down over weeks and months. And when you look at the media coverage around Iran, Israel, Palestine, US, it's all put in a kind of the balance has been disturbed frame. Iran's now hitting out at the Gulf nations. Trump's lost it, and he's launched this aggressive war in Iran. But not only does Trump, as a political personality, thrive on chaos, but the Israelis thrive on chaos. And this is also really important to convey. And it's something which is so obvious, but is missed from being said so often with Israel. And the thing is that if you just switch over from Israel in English to Israel in Hebrew, that is to say, if you listen to Netanyahu in his own terms speaking to the Israeli public, and the other headbangers in Israeli power, they're all clear that they want, yes indeed, to go after Iran. They've been wanting it for decades, to expand Israel, to grind the Palestinians into dust and all the rest of it. And you may have noticed that they're even talking about Amalek again in the Iranian context. So not only were the Palestinians Amalek in Gaza, but now the Iranians are Amalek. So again, I do see that there is a continuum here of violence. The Israelis, as I said in our last meeting here in December, January, that the Israelis, the internal logic of Israeli Zionism is that it sort of thrives on conflict. And so actually it cannot exist, and practically it means Netanyahu's political career cannot exist without this kind of ongoing eternal conflict. And so this is obviously a gift to Netanyahu, practically and metaphorically. But unfortunately it means that it could go on for quite a long time. We haven't mentioned Lebanon, and that Israel will also, now it's fighting wars on, is it 7 or 9 fronts? If you include the US Congress, it's probably 8. So it now also wants to push into Lebanon, or is doing so. So it sees this as an opportunity to sort of once in a generation weaken all of its regional adversaries, grind them down another level, basically, set them back decades further. Meanwhile, to put this all back into sort of practical reality, Palestinian civilians in Gaza are still starving, not literally with famine, but they're on the brink of famine all the time. And I read that the Americans have now hit the water desalination plants in Iran, which will mean Iran is highly likely to do the same to the Gulf countries. which is highly likely to extend the timetable of the war into several weeks rather than a couple of weeks. So I would say it's spiraling out of control, but it's not really out of control, because if you seek to seed and create chaos, this is actually what you've intended. So it might be out of control in the sense that it's bad for civilians, but for those who are actually lighting a flame, I mean, if you're an arsonist, when you see the fire spread, this is actually your objective being realized. That's what we're seeing here.
Russia-Ukraine war also connected to these conflicts?
I do see it through the realm of the US, Russia, and China. China at the moment has what the Americans don't have in many ways. The American economy is basically a Ponzi scheme upheld by the US military and the dollar and stuffing the dollar down everyone's throat around the world. Yes. If that becomes threatened, the whole thing goes kaput, basically. And then you're in a world where the Chinese are laughing because they're now making everything. They've got arguably a much more productive workforce, much sort of stronger, in a sense, stronger on paper civilization. At the moment, the thing that the Chinese don't have, in a sense, is AI. And I think the AI thing is key, because actually the Americans are hoping that that will be their kind of rebalancing leverage over the next decade, which is why obviously they've tried to control the chips going into China, which I, by the way, just as a side note, don't think they will succeed to limit China by those sorts of measures. However, we've already seen in this last fortnight the use of AI in the Iran war. So we can see that the American empire and current administration is trying to catalyze around this as a kind of, as I say, a point of leverage, brazenly mixing the latest of kind of like experimental technology with war and killing in a way that, you know, let's say European leftists would have cried foul over 2 years ago, but no longer feel they can, because basically Europe is under the boot of Trump now, as much as, arguably or in a different way, but as much as the Gulf states are. Europe has become impotent, really, to a great extent through its own missteps in handling Trump. But in terms of these, to zoom out again, these global powers, I see America trying to assert itself in a context where it is otherwise declining. But to be honest, it's also unavoidable to see it, rather than in the lineage of empires and competing empires. It's also really difficult to resist the temptation of seeing this in, if not sort of civilizational decline, then sort of end of the world interpretations, because, you know, Trump rips up the rule book on US politics and corruption. He rips up the rule book on diplomacy. International law is gone. I mean, it doesn't even exist anymore, I would argue. And he plays the strongman in the jungle, and he takes everything to the next level with real kinetic consequences. And then you add in all of the religious elements into the Middle East, and, to put it in a shorthand, igniting of the Shia flame and where that can go. And then I know that you want to discuss also Jerusalem and the igniting of the Muslim flame around Temple Mount and everything. So it's difficult not to see it in those sorts of apocalyptic terms as well. But I think here, being rooted in Southeast Asia for a moment, just imagining it, as I say, from the Chinese perspective, of course it's disruptive for the global economy that has effects in Southeast Asia as well as, you know, China through the global economy itself. But this does look like America shooting itself in the foot, I believe, from the Chinese perspective. How it plays out with Russia, let's see. But I think from the Russian perspective, it will be more about the resource control. How things go with Iran, though, it seems possible to me that Russia will increase its support of Iran, depending on how things play out. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So next question is that how do you see the roles of the surrounding countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon during these times?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, basically, Trump rules the world at the moment. That's the vibe that you get from watching the news. But as I mentioned, this is just a part of the world that's a playground for the Israelis and Americans, basically, and they've decided to launch a rave of violence. Egypt, all the Gulf states, they're all under the American boot in one way or another. They're all divided and ruled over in one way or another, with the exception of Iran, to simplify it for a moment. And with the hitting of the Gulf states by the Iranians in terms of oil, gas, some civilian infrastructure, you wonder what is the position of the Gulf states. My understanding is that the Gulf states didn't want this, even though some of them have a strategic rivalry with the Iranians. And actually, I do think, yes, that this does expose of course, the fact that you can't trust the Americans. Everyone knows that you can't trust the Americans to protect you. They put the bases there, but the bases are just so you don't revolt against them. They're not to protect you. Yeah. Although I think we'll see some movement in terms of like Gulf defense in the next decade, if there's anything left. But basically, with the light that has been illuminated by the Iran war, all of these countries are shown to be impotent. And to an extent, we already know of them as quite impotent. But I think that in the face of this sort of Trump violent rave with Netanyahu, we're seeing also how the Europeans are impotent. Spain came out, and then Spain is under like economic blockade, in inverted commas. The UK is afraid to say anything, so it's backtracked and is now allowing the Americans to use its bases. Basically, we've entered a world where Trump is like a sort of an imperial ruler, but not just of North America, but of the previous sort of American influence network. In other words, through its allies. In other words, America is now cashing in on its military bases around the world and its integration or its allies' reliance on its systems to basically say, okay, well, we have this leverage over you, fall in line. So it's in effect, it's sort of taking like semi-soft power, the fact like, European governments' email systems run on Microsoft Outlook, and turning this kind of soft power into a hard power. That's kind of what Trump has done and is doing. And the Europeans don't have the fortitude to really manifest a meaningful response. But by the way, that's a metaphor for all of the Arab and Muslim nations with Palestine and Gaza. So it's just the same. So the impotence, the division, the lack of spine and backbone, the inability to resist, the sort of spread from, in a sense, the Middle East to Europe now, as America has gone beyond its previous limits of using its control and influence. So the global South, as it's called, has already cried foul over this dynamic for decades. But it's like now, finally, not only are the Middle Eastern Gulf states been humiliated by this contract with the Americans, but so have the Europeans. They've been humiliated by this contract with the Americans, and sort of everyone's left naked, and Trump's the one at the top of the of the pyramid, effectively. Meanwhile, yes, Russia and China look on. It's hard to see, though, how this, and I've already alluded to this, but how this does anything but weaken the American empire, because it shows that these contracts with them are fragile and they're built on sand. And the Americans are now burning, millions or billions of dollars a day, of which they don't have, by the way. And it's like, well, it's on what? Because Iran actually didn't pose a threat. Do they want the resources? I don't think it's that play here. Which means that they've basically done it on sort of ideological grounds from the American internal point of view, or purely to satisfy the Israeli strategic goals, which you could also argue is what's really driving all of this. I think it's both combined. I think that, this is a sort of pipe dream for Netanyahu. Trump 2 is fantastic. This is the golden opportunity. Go for it. But it's just like the Israelis raided the Bekaa Valley and tried to get the remains of an Israeli soldier last week. The Israelis have kind of full spectrum sort of informational insight, I feel, into this region. That is to say that their intelligence is top notch. I don't think there are any quote unquote unintended consequences with this. And that even involves or extends to civilian damage in Israel. So I don't believe that this is a situation where, okay, Iran is hitting Israel hard, and this is like, oh, the Israelis didn't think of this. I'm sorry to say, I really don't believe this at all. The Israelis know very well that this is the exact playbook of what Iran would do if they did this. That is to say that the Iranians have been saying that if this happens, this is how they will respond. They will respond all of the oil, all of the American bases, they'll hit Tel Aviv, they'll wipe it out, This is exactly what's been promised, and this is what's being delivered. So I don't feel that this is a sort of, Israel has inadvertently brought this on itself through its own regional hubris. I don't believe that at all. I think that the Israelis have this strategic aim to go after Iran. And it's just, they just don't care about the civilians. They don't care about the Israelis. They don't care. And I'm telling you, they don't care. And that's, their military doctrine, we talk of military doctrine, the Israeli military doctrine is better to sacrifice our own people than to lose leverage with our adversaries.
Yeah.
So even if there are 10,000 casualties in Israel, it's not really changing the game. Because, Israel may use nuclear weapons, but effectively Israel's already in a maximalist aggressive posture. So they already know the Iranian playbook, and they already, I believe, know the Iranian limits. I actually don't think that from the Israeli side, this is sort of a risky scenario. Iran isn't that close to them. So in a sense, just to conclude this small point, it's almost like everyone else is paying the price of Netanyahu's project at the moment, which is that the Americans are paying literally for it, and the American contracts in the region are. But the Israelis are getting their strategic objective realized. I just want to add one final catalyzing thought around that, which is that, I don't know if you noticed, but Netanyahu said, I think it was the end of last year, how he wants Israel to pivot from no longer relying on American military aid. And that should be quite a terrifying thought as a spectator, because what we're saying there is that Israel believes it will be in a position where it no longer requires American military power, and it will be able to effectively go off on its own and make its own strategic choices. To an extent, it already has obviously reached that. But if they're getting to the stage where they're literally deliberately decoupling, and the Israelis can actually start to relinquish their relationship with the American Congress and everything, that should be a terrifying thought. Because at the moment, sort of, to an extent, keeping up appearances with the Americans to get the tens of millions of military aid dollars is a limit on the Israelis. If they get to a stage where they feel that they're actually okay on their own, that is terrifying, I think. So I see what's happening here with Iran being weakened, and America potentially being economically weakened by this war and dynamic, is that Israel sees opportunities for it to become more of the regional hegemon than the United States is. In other words, can it turn the Abraham Accords from relationships with the Gulf states and America into something like the Gulf states under the protection of the Israelis? That's me hypothesizing. I don't think there's any strong evidence for that, but I think looking at things strategically based on what we do know, that's an obvious vector and objective that they would have.
Yeah, that's interesting. Next question is that while all eyes are on the Iran war during these days, Gaza went through a genocide with 50% land still illegally under IDF control, without proper governance and elections, and hostilities are also rising in the West Bank. Do these emerging conflicts distract the world from addressing the root causes?
In an immediate sense, I feel that they are a distraction. But as I mentioned before, I think that people see this on a kind of Gaza continuum. In a sense, what we see literally in Tehran is almost like the Gaza-ification of Tehran. It's like the Israeli shock and awe project. I think, though, that, as I say, people see, oh, the Israelis are at it again. That's what people will draw as a conclusion. Or the Americans are at it again, and they'll think back to Iraq, which is worth mentioning that they don't need to go as far back as Iraq, but that's probably what they will go back to. I think people see that with the shock and awe of the situation, and with the dynamic, and with the Secretary of War saying we're punching them while they're down and that's how it should be, I think people just raise their eyebrows and facepalm and just think, what the hell is happening to the world? And then they think, Gaza, Venezuela, and now they think Iran. And they see it on that continuum, and they see who are the actors here. It wasn't Iran. In the political spheres in Europe, I'm sure people talk to themselves about the Iranians, and they convince themselves, that the Iran nuclear threat and all the rest of it. But actually, look what's happening to the world, and look what's happening to the global economy. If Iran had nuclear weapons, this wouldn't have happened, which arguably would have made the region and the world more stable. Just a very kind of practical game theory chessboard map out of it. I think people can see that. So, as I say, I think this all just feeds into these are the destabilizing hooligan forces in the world. And we're seeing, as we've said before, but like a sort of parallel moral degradation at the same time, where flagrantly leaders no longer follow the rules, the conventions that we all thought that we were following. I want to say more on that topic later, because I think that we know very well that these were never being followed, but these were the stories that we have been telling ourselves about how the world operates.
Okay. Yeah, next question is what do you make of the settlements in the West Bank, particularly East Jerusalem? The percentages of Palestinians and the illegal Israeli settlers in those regions. Is it another slow colonial pattern of stealing land?
It's definitely as you described. The issue is that the Israelis were sort of, in a sense, let's say, quote unquote, forced to stop the Gaza genocide, or to pause it, or to change gear. Let's say, but it's like in order to get them to stop, they're now swallowing up land in the West Bank. But the dynamics of that are that now they've stopped the full spectrum night and day killing in Gaza, which was literally a machine eating children. I mean, it was a death camp. Whereas it's now kind of gone back to more of a prison camp. The payoff from that is that, okay, now you can steal more of the West Bank, and you can, in a sense, start to turn the West Bank into a mini Gaza. You turn up the pressure in the West Bank. In terms of the settlements, I've been there. The settlements are literally just, I mean, there are economic drivers why some of the Israelis move there, because it's subsidized. So it's a bit like, it's a bit like the economic drivers that drive people to low tax areas of the Gulf states, ironically. But there's also the ideological settlers as well. But basically, it's just about land, theft, power, control, and territory. It is what it looks like on the tin. And it's like, again, it's kind of helpful and practical to see the Israelis as just, okay, the teacher has gone into the playground and said you have to stop beating Jim up, but you can go and eat his lunch. That's what's happening. It's like, okay, stop bombing Gaza day and night, but you can go and steal the West Bank. You up the settlement building. This is a dynamic that has long played out. Whenever American administrations have publicly rebuked the Israelis, they just increase the number of settlement constructions. So that's the power dynamic. And the reminder is, just to add to that the Israelis don't need or want the Palestinians. They don't want or need the Palestinians for labor. They don't rely on Palestinians for labor. If they want labor, they will take it from other countries. So the problem is, it's an extermination scenario. It's displacement or extermination. And that's again, just the genocide continued in a different way in the West Bank.
Okay. Next question is that, by the way, I had a few maps here as well. Can I show them?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I talked about it's going gradually, right? So right now in Gaza, we talked about it, the yellow line, right? 50% of the territory is still under IDF control. Yeah. And there was this map of OCHA as well, OCHA.
Yeah.
And they did a very good job on defining all the areas of the settlements, the red areas. And they also marked off East Jerusalem, separately of East Jerusalem as well.
Yeah.
And I was reading that at the current time in East Jerusalem, there are like 60% Palestinians there and 40% illegal Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem.
I want to highlight something with this, which is that OCHA, they always do an amazing job with this. And if you want to know what's really happening in the West Bank, you can just look at these maps.
Yeah.
Now, this is incredible because what this shows is that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank or of Palestinian territory is observed in almost a scientific state.
Yeah.
That is to say that the level of detail of awareness of Israel's crimes, theft, and occupation is mapped down to the meter.
Yeah.
And this is by a UN body.
Yeah.
Now, all of the world powers know this. So I want to talk or come on to later the issue about sort of naivety. But this illuminates how if we pretend that we don't know what Israel's doing, it's belied by these details, which is it's very obvious what the Israelis are doing. And actually their strategic aims, even laid out immediately on the West Bank, are absolutely obvious to anyone. And it's almost like when looking at what the Israelis do, there are these kind of thought gates that you can't go beyond. There's only certain explanations or narratives you can use to explain reality. But the fact that they're just blatantly stealing everything they can and killing everyone they can, starving life, suffocating life, which is what they're doing, and now extending that to Lebanon and Iran, is the simple truth, but it's also a forbidden truth. And so all of the explanations we see in the so-called mainstream media are basically people just kidding themselves. They're kidding themselves about what's happening. And that extends with Iran. The most obvious way in which that manifests is people saying, oh, you know, maybe this will lead to chaos in Iran. Maybe you'll get a leader in Iran that's worse than the previous one and more radical and more extreme. The Israelis love that. That is literally how the Israelis operate, is through defined chaos, as long as they feel that they're 1 or 2 or 3 steps ahead. That is the truth of it. And anyone that honestly reads the history and the maps and the papers can see that. But people are unable to confront that reality and admit it for what it is.
Yeah, a lot of work needs to be done on this map, like you described, but to the meter. Israelis are very good at this, and the other side also needs to be reactive.
Yeah.
My next question is that is Israel tunnel digging in the old city? Yeah, very important question. Is Israel tunnel digging in the old city, as reported by Wafa news agency, like the 2021 Aqsa attack, which provoked towards October 7th attacks? Is Israel trying to provoke a Hamas reaction to shout that no disarming has taken place? And if there is no Hamas reaction, they'll revert back to the 2021 style provocation of East Jerusalem and Aqsa compound. What are your thoughts on that?
I honestly feel that Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran are very weak at the moment. And I feel that Hamas doesn't have the ability to stage a reaction in the terms that I believe you're imagining with this question. That is to say, if there's an almighty provocation in Jerusalem, would Hamas be able to manifest a reaction like that which caused October 7th or another such incident? I don't believe so. If the Israelis launched a provocation at the moment, the Hamas and the other fighting groups' reaction will be to unleash stabbing and ramming attacks in Jerusalem and on Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and it may really blow up as a scenario, in the sense that the volume of these attacks may really increase, and it may feel like a kind of third intifada, perhaps. Not my language, but their framing. But I don't see that happening, to be honest, at the moment, because it's let's see. I don't see that happening in the next year or 2 years, to be honest, because you see, for example, Hamas and Iran, they have to retain some of their escalation ladder in the case that they are existentially threatened, meaning that they really believe they're potentially going to be wiped out. And I don't think that the kind of scenario you're talking about would match that, and so I don't think it would blow up, as I believe you're alluding to. Equally, what we're seeing with the Iran war, as I mentioned at the very top, the Iranian government is not the Iranian regime, is not the Iranian leader. There's different sort of layers. This is a very entrenched power. For the Israelis to really grind it down will take, I think, months or years, to the extent that they'd like to turn Iran into Gaza now, or to weaken the Iranians as much as they've weakened Hamas, will take years. Let's be clear about that. So the Iranians have to hold back some of their escalation space, as do Hamas and the Palestinian fighting groups vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinian conflict. So I don't see a blow-up happening soon.
Okay. Yeah, next question is, looking at the pattern of history, Netanyahu often speaks about the art of the deal. Yet Israel's version seems to be that make a deal, then reject it later. Make a deal, then reject it later. Again and again, negotiations are repeated, followed by rejection, while land control continues to expand. Even now, 50% of Gaza remains under IDF control since October 7, 2023, with a vague ceasefire deal in January 2026. This gradual expansion often goes unnoticed by surrounding states. How can this colonial pattern be changed?
My take on this is that the Israelis and Americans don't play fair when it comes to ceasefires and agreements. They use them to lock in scenarios that are beneficial to them in the short term before relaunching conflict. Just as we've seen with Iran, the Americans were negotiating with the Iranians, and then they launched the war. So for them, diplomacy is not a religion. It's not something they believe in. It's literally a tool in their arsenal, which they will employ up to the extent that it serves their immediate interests. You only have to go back to WikiLeaks to see that the United Nations in New York itself, the Americans surveil all of the delegations. That in some cases they even took the DNA from delegations to try and effectively build up leverage that they can, whether it's extortion or whether it's manipulation or just spying on all of their. You have to remember, the Americans see everyone as an adversary, as we've just seen with Trump and the fact that the Europeans have now realized that they are subject to American pressure. The Americans are shameless in employing just like the Israelis, employing all the powers they can to exert their control and influence. So let's say, if that's how they treat the United Nations, which is meant to be the kind of the beholder of the keys of the rules of the game, then how are they going to treat a ceasefire agreement with the poor little old Palestinians? I mean, it's never going to be a fair fight. So I don't believe that you can trust the paper that it's written on, and I think they know this very well. And I think, to be fair, I don't think people are under that illusion. I think that's probably why Hamas, for example, to the extent that it still exists, its kind of strategic offering to Israel was a long-term ceasefire agreement, a hudna, rather than, in a sense, something that's like on paper, a settlement, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Not sure if I've answered that correctly, but
yeah. The final question is, what are your thoughts on the future of journalism and social media algorithms? How honest are independent news organizations?
I believe that the world's crises are clearer than ever. And what we're lacking is not information and access to information. What we're lacking is the ability to manifest a response. And I think this affects individuals and groups and collectives. And just like the Arab nations have effectively completely abandoned the Palestinians, there's absolutely no solidarity manifested by the actual countries. There may be at the level of the peoples, but not at the countries. Just as the Europeans haven't yet been able to get themselves together, particularly in the face of Trump's leveraging of soft power. Not even to mention divisions by religion. It's to say that Muslim countries as a collective haven't been able to manifest a response meaningfully to stop the Gaza genocide, for instance. The real issue is not that we don't know what's happening. The issue is that we don't know how to manifest a response to what's happening. And the issue is that we have been divided and ruled. We have been distracted, not just as countries, but as people. And therefore, what's sort of lacking is agency, in a sense, individual and collective agency, and also, I would say, really the ability to manifest unity. You see this with having spent time in Gaza, frankly. You see the internal fighting, not literally violent fighting, but the sort of ideological fighting among different groups there. I mean, yes, there are also the kind of cliches of Hamas was the authority in Gaza and therefore it didn't want other groups with competing ideologies or policies to gain control. Yes, there's that. But I'm talking about beneath that. I'm talking about the fact that it can be difficult to organize responses to crises and challenges when there are other groups that are slagging you off, basically, and competing. And it's the classic kind of divide and rule, but it's also not just external. It's also something that humans succumb to themselves. So in a sense, I feel like it's almost the reason why I use the word distraction here is quite deliberate, because distraction implies a lack of concentration. And I feel that is what this is about. It's a bit like, I will make a slightly controversial sort of sub-point, but it's a bit like the Sunni Muslims saying, oh, the Iranian Shia are not real Muslims, which for me is laughable, yeah. It's like, well, they are Muslims, you just don't like part of their sort of ideology or their theology, and you, for whatever reason, feel so threatened in your own sense of self and your own sense of what's right that you have to start negating others. And so it becomes, I think, this word of concentration, which is that if you just concentrate on what's your goal and what's your truth and what is that you see that needs to be done, and stop getting distracted by naysaying about others, that's the real lever to pull. And I think this probably speaks to some of the points I made in my Morocco TEDx talk about sort of what's the purpose, what's the driver, what's the focus mechanism. Because so often splintering just causes such a weakening of effect that meaningful responses cannot be manifested. It's just the same with the Palestinian internal division, with Hamas and the competing authorities. If they can be divided, which we all know they are, it means that the Palestinians are like basically mortally weakened. It's as simple as that. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge that belief that things can change is part of things being able to change. And this works at the community and the individual level. I mean, I'm not going to focus on the individual level and start talking about sort of like positive psychology and stuff, because I don't think that's particularly relevant. But the extent to which groups of people can organize together and believe in their collective ability to unite and execute is the key up-leveler. And certainly my experiences in Gaza, for example, or Egypt show that. And I was listening to a podcast recently which I found quite interesting, which is really touched on something I felt in Vietnam, which was that in Vietnam I was really impressed, literally, by what I felt was just hard to find exactly sort of the words to put it, but the drive of people. You felt, and also people's relationship with their faith, I found quite fascinating and endearing, to be honest. And it reminded me of Palestine, which is that there are populations who are willing to die for what they believe, and there are those that are not.
Vietnam War, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you got the Vietnam against Americans, but there are, according to whatever wisdom behind it, but there are countries and peoples and groups who are catalyzed around what they believe and are able to manifest a united, concentrated determination to stand up for themselves and their rights or their causes. And then there are those nations which succumb to distraction and disorganization and disarray, and just fall over. And I found that the vibe in Vietnam was the former, which was very interesting. And to be honest, we're speaking in Ramadan now, but my, some of my fond memories of Gaza are just the sheer determination of people just to concentrate on surviving. It's a funny thing to say, but if you just decide to survive, you just decide to kind of narrow your vision to concentrate on certain tenets of life. That is a massive up-leveler. So what I mean is, to put it in a different way for a moment, you can say that at the sort of psychological level, it's just about numbing. You just numb out, watch the things that have the chance to undermine your concentration. But at the same time, it's determination. It's another way of framing it. And the people of Palestine are the determined people. I'll always remember the mosques in Gaza, and they would say "Amen" like they mean it. And this, for me, is quite an interesting point, because if you sort of really believe what you're saying and you really say Amen with sort of every cell of your body, we're talking about a level of concentration and integration that becomes kind of undistractable. And I think that's what we can see the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, manifest. And that's what I sort of felt in Vietnam. But I think it speaks to the human experience as well, at the Ramadan time, but also how we can organize and what that looks like with information, because you asked about journalism, in the face of the world's crises and chaos. And I just wanted to add that people actually feel quite disturbed by the current situation. I mean, people already felt disturbed by the Gaza genocide and climate change and the Venezuela kidnap and all of these things. But people really feel disturbed now. I'm not talking because some, Europeans are trapped in Dubai or something. I'm not talking about this at all. I'm talking about the fact that people really feel that the world is so unstable now, and that the rules have been so blatantly torn up. And people know very well that the ratchet goes in one direction and the velocity is going in one direction. And people really feel disempowered, and that the world is fragile and it's invasively fragile on them. And then we haven't really today had time to throw in the religious questions and a lot of the end time and apocalyptic kind of undertones to this from the Israeli side or whatever. But people, for good reason, intuit that there is this kind of vibe around it. And this is before we've even mentioned the global economic turmoil that will come from what's happening, and the fact that this has meaningful effects on people throughout the world, and that the American powers that be and the Israeli powers that be have decided that the world is going to go through this trauma because of their lust for violence and control, and that the whole world is being dragged with them, and that we're just out of control. But Palestinians have been going through this for decades, and as I just mentioned, they've shown the way forward, which is concentration and determination. And the only hope is to hope, to be honest, and it's to blindly not succumb, because the world in the kind of symmetric and linear readout is just like it's the meteorite is heading for Earth, basically, to put it in a metaphor. We're in a don't look up moment, not just with the climate, but with global stability, with global economy, and with the movement of peoples, and global fragility, not to mention the fragility of values that is being eroded as well. But individuals should protect their own mental health to the extent which it's appropriate to do so, because as we said last time in December and January, the Israelis want people to see Palestinian death. They want people to be affected. So the extent to which people feel they need to back off and back away because what they're seeing that's happening in the world is too invasive, people should do that. I think that's a good point to end on. Yeah.
Okay, so now I'll conclude it. I'd like to conclude it by mentioning first a hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. While a companion was asking him about the times of tribulation, Prophet Muhammad said that at that time there will be some people who will invite others to the door of hell, to the doors of hell. I'm basically paraphrasing the hadith. The companion then asked that, who are those people? And Prophet Muhammad replied that those are the people among ourselves. So the companion asked, what shall I do in those times? And the Prophet replied that, adhere to the righteous group of people and a righteous leader, meaning an imam. And the companion asked a very beautiful question that, what if there is no righteous group of people, nor an imam, nor a righteous leader? Then what? And Prophet Muhammad replied, keep away from all those different sects. Meaning, if all the groups are bad groups, keep away from all of them. Even if you had to bite the root of a tree until you meet Allah while you are in that state, even if your survival is difficult, remain steadfast on truth. So this hadith had a big impact on me in terms of telling that even if you are the only one on truth, remain in that state amid the tough circumstances around you. And this is where your personality inspired me a lot in these times as well, where you consistently stood up for truth and kept believing in the skills and talents rather than the unjust corporate capitalist sectors who try to shun people like yourself and many others. I saw many of your 2014 tweets when covering the 2014 war, where even though many of those tweets had negligible following, but you remain consistent in pushing the narrative for truth, albeit without any support. That also motivated me quite a lot. And now to tie it all with Gaza and Palestine, they are the people who remained consistent and steadfast for truth for over 75 years. in the toughest of circumstances. They never gave up despite the deadly bombs continuously staring at them. And I heard something very pertinent from an analyst that had it been any other nation or any other group of people, they would have given up and changed directions by now. But Palestine didn't. Palestine never gave up. Their story really motivates us. Their story motivates us the most and gives us confidence as well to rise up against oppression and injustice. To rise up against oppression and injustice, from corruption in the topmost echelons, in the deep states and governments, to all the unjust corporate capitalist sectors in this world. So hats off to the heroic resistance of Palestine. And lastly, I must mention, if there was because we have been doing this for quite some time now, there was a speech of yours in Malaysia in 2014, pushing through pain, steadfastness and light at Islamic Arts Museum. You told me about this place, by the way, and I felt that this place also had a calling on me. So I also visited this place. In your speech, you mentioned that in the 21st century, sometimes those who understand us best are not the people we have access to face to face. They are the people who live thousands of miles away, with whom we communicate by bits through binary codes, meaning the social media platforms. So these words, listening these words really resonated with me, and it felt as if they were for me. And here we are doing this type of work, right? So lastly, you told me to say this, and I'll say it now, that may Allah accept our efforts. May Allah accept these efforts and strengthen us. With that, I conclude. Any final words?
No, not at all. Yeah, it was good. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's Ramadan. I would like to make a prayer as well.
Sure.
Before we finish it off. So, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. I just made this prayer that may Allah accept our efforts and strengthen us in the future. I'll make some prayers in Arabic as well. Ya Hayyu Ya Qayyum bi rahmatika astaghith. Rabbi ighfir warham wa anta khairur rahimin. Astaghfirullah Rabbi min kulli dhanbin wa atubu ilayh. Allahumma ajirni minan nar. Allahumma ajirni minan nar. Allahumma ajirni minan nar. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min jahdil bala'i wa darkis shaqa'i wa su'il qada'i wa shamatatil a'da. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billahil aliyyil azim. Allahumma aftah li abwaaba rahmatik. Rabbi zidni ilma. Rabbi zidni ilma. Rabbi zidni ilma. May Allah grant us success in this life and the next. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adhaban nar. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyil kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Yeah. That I'll conclude. Ramzan Mubarak to everybody.
Thank you. Happy Eid to everyone.
Yeah.